the Board of Trustees. I have some announcements this morning. On June 17th, the Climate Smart Challenge is at 7 p.m. on Zoom, and speak to Mike Cox for more information. Our annual report, so any committee leaders, please write a concise summary of the committee activities from last July to present and email it to the office manager. Thank you. And June 20th to 23rd is our General Assembly. It's taking place virtually. This is the annual gathering of the Unitarian Universalists, where we conduct business of the association, explore the theological underpinnings of our faith, and lean fully into our mission and principles. Thank you.
Our opening words this morning come from the Reverend Elizabeth Mount, a reading titled Co-Regulation. From our very first breath, we reach out. Co-regulation, not self-regulation, is our nature. We find our cues from the sun and the moon, from each other, parent and caregiver. We find our place in this great turning planet by turning to one another. Generation to generation, we awaken to the dawn and fall asleep at the evening's end. Our life's journey is part of something greater, something simple, something divine. A flame cannot be lit without a spark. A life cannot begin without the air. And we cannot begin to find ourselves without love. May we reach out to one another. May we offer love and nurturing care. May we join together in celebration of our interdependence and of our shared lives. In this spirit, may we worship.
Good morning. I am not Jenny Weaver, as you may have read in some materials. I hope you're not disappointed. But I am her husband, Tyler, and it's been some time since I was a worship associate up here. But I've returned today while Jenny recovers from a surgical procedure earlier this week. She's just not quite up to being here today. But she's doing all right. Father's Day is an interesting day. I know for many people it's fraught with confusion and difficulty because their fathers were terrible parents and often terrible people. Those who've suffered from bad fathers include some people here in this room and an unfortunately large number of people I know outside of church as well. In the informal survey that's been my 54 years of talking to people and learning about their lives, I've heard a lot more about terrible fathers than I've heard about terrible mothers. This is not to say that all fathers are bad, because of course they're not, or that there are no terrible mothers out there, because of course there are. But for whatever reason, perhaps a cultural lenience on terrible fathers, or an intense cultural pressure on mothers to be better parents, it's at least been my perception that more of us have troubled relationships with our fathers than our mothers. That perception is probably affected by the fact that my wife's father was a monster. He still is. And I don't know if I can put it more clearly or accurately than that without going into some awful detail, but it's been a lifetime of recovery for her from that father. But I know that despite that, she was looking forward to talking today, not to talk about her father, but to recognize the man who became her substitute father. And that was my father, Tim Weaver. My dad was a good man and a good father. I don't want to give anyone the impression that he was perfect, because he wasn't. His mouth often operated faster than his brain. He had a knack for saying the wrong thing without realizing that he had said it. Things like being overly negative about possible names for his grandchildren, or, making regrettable comments about a loved one's feelings or appearance. But he had a great capacity for love and a great sense of humor. And after a rough start, he loved my wife at least as much as his own children, and took the role of being a father figure in her life. He particularly loved taking advantage of Jenny's trusting nature by telling her some crazily untrue story or fact that she would believe, and that they would both laugh about loudly once she realized what was going on. You think she might have figured this out after about 10 or 15 years, but it continued right up until the end of his life. We lost him just over 14 years ago, and we miss him dearly. His love for Jenny was incredibly healing for her, and I know she thinks about him every Father's Day and what he meant to her. And I think that's what Father's Day and maybe Mother's Day should really be about. Honoring those in your life who cared for you and loved you for who you are and what you are. Maybe that's your parents. Maybe it's not. But I hope you're all fortunate enough to have had someone like that in your life. And if you have, take a moment to think about them today. And if they're still around, give them a call. So today, I dedicate the lighting of our chalice to the love we have found in our lives, parental or otherwise. So if you could please recite with me from your order of service. As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly, because we are one family. To take good care of the earth, because it is our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness, because that is how we will all become the best that we can be.
For our first song, we're going to sing Building Bridges, number 1023 in the Teal Book. We're going to try a three-part round. This is an experiment, but we can do it. I'm sure we can do it. You're starting group 1. Go there. And group 3.
I have a story today that comes out of the Kabbalistic tradition, so Jewish mysticism. And this is a free retelling that I found online. At the beginning of time, before anything else at all existed, love was there. And it filled up everything in the whole universe. But love got bored and lonely. There was no one to be with love. So one day, love decided to make a world. First, love took a deep breath, and then a deeper breath. Love got all squished up, taking the deepest breath ever, and was so squished up that it squeezed out darkness. The darkness was all around, thick and shiny and black. It was beautiful, but now love couldn't see anything. Love waved its arms and legs around, but the darkness was everywhere. I have to do something about this, said love. Love thought for a moment and tried to think of the most wonderful and beautiful, warm thoughts ever. Love thought harder and harder and harder, and all of a sudden love called out, "I want light." And pop. all of the warmth and wonderful and beautiful thoughts exploded outward in 10 different directions and shaped themselves into 10 glowing glass balls. Each ball was filled with a spinning lump of pure light and warmth. Some of the spare good thoughts couldn't quite fit into the glass and became dust and water vapor and seeds and molecules that could form animals eventually. Love said, "This is amazing. I better make something for the light to shine on now." So it waved its arms and kicked its legs, and all of the dust and water vapor and molecules that had been scattered around formed into another huge ball. This one with dirt and water and animals. Love called this ball the earth. The 10 balls of light started toward the earth, but were too fragile to move at the speed that they were moving. And they soon broke open and shattered, and all the good thoughts scattered and flew out like sparks everywhere on the earth and out in space in tiny bits instead of big clumps. "Oh no," said Love. "I'm too big. I'll never find all those tiny sparks. I have to make one more thing." So Love waved its arms and kicked its legs one last time. And the people appeared on earth. They didn't know it, but they were created with one job: to find these sparks, these tiny pieces of wonderful goodness, and bring them together in big clumps. When enough clumps are there, I will recreate the big glass containers, Love told them. And this time, I will set them down more carefully, Love said. And that is our story. I'd invite you to join me in a centering moment with these words from Sarah Goodman. Join me in a spirit of prayer and meditation. Find a comfortable place for your body to rest. Breathe as deeply as you are able. Hold in your mind an image of all things, all beings coming from the same tree, roots stretched in limitless tangles of connection and sustenance, interconnected and interlaced in a web of living and dying that is so beautifully designed and most times invisible. Join me in breathing. Breathe in for our lives touched by ancestors known and unknown. Breathe out for living lives that will touch our descendants. Breathe in for folks held in loving arms as they were raised up. Breathe out for folks who had to make their own way too early in their lives. Breathe in for beloveds who hold you close in our hearts every day. Breathe out for beloveds we sometimes have trouble reaching out to. Breathe in for loving. Breathe out for losing. Breathe in for parents doing the best they can. Breathe out for the impossible decisions they've had to make. Breathe in for those living with addiction, mental illness, and grief. Breathe out for those living with and caring for folks living with addiction, mental health illness, and grief. Breathe in for caregivers of all kind who give of themselves to make other people's lives better, more whole. Breathe out to honor this holy work. Let us take a moment of silence together. May it be so.
Most Sundays, we invite the congregation to come up and share their joys or sorrows. If you have a joy or sorrow you'd like to share, please come up, give us your name and a couple sentences, and pour a little bit of water in the bowl for a joy, or a stone in the bowl for a sorrow, so that we can help bear your sorrow. As a I'll place a little more water in the bowl for the joys that remain unspoken, as well as a stone for the unspoken sorrows in our hearts.
Sing number 108 in the Black Book, My Life Flows in Endless Song. This won't be around. We'll sing it all the way through, all the verses.
When this group finishes verse 1, this group can start verse 2.
No.
This theme of today's service is being a caregiver. And there's a few ways you can be a caregiver to this church. You can be here with your presence, which you've already done. You can provide your service, which many of us do. And you can also contribute financially. Could the ushers please bring the baskets around to the congregation?
It's always interesting when you set a sermon topic weeks in advance, and as you begin doing the actual research and writing and reflection, where it ends up leading you. But as John Lennon famously sung, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. The morning after my grandfather died, I remember waking up and my grandmother let me help her make breakfast, something she had never allowed before. After cooking, we both sat at the kitchen table. We didn't talk much, and despite having a pile of bacon and eggs between us, neither of us was eating. After some time of pushing food around on my plate with a fork, my grandmother broke the silence. "I feel horrible that I'm so relieved he's dead." I didn't know what to say to her to offer comfort, and simply said, "It's okay." To the outside observer, my grandmother's comment would have come across as callous. But if you knew my grandmother and how deeply she cared for and loved my grandfather, especially for the last 17 years of his life, I think you'd understand. For the 16 years preceding that morning, my grandmother had functioned as the sole caregiver and home health aide for my grandfather. He was diagnosed with a rare neurological disease. This rare disease rapidly spread and caused nerve tissue to swell and led to fatigue, muscle weakness, and eventual paralysis. By the time the progression of this disease had slowed, my grandfather struggled to feed himself. He couldn't bathe himself. He couldn't go to the bathroom alone or walk. And there was my grandmother through it all. My grandfather never stopped working. He was that sort of man. He continued to run his auto body shop from hospital beds, and eventually, when he was able to move home, from his bed at home. A constant stream of my grandfather's employees and work colleagues were in and out of the house, sometimes at all hours of the night. Eventually, he did regain a little bit of control over large muscle groups, and he gained the ability to go into work, and with time and some modifications to his car, was able to even drive himself. But my grandmother still had to tend to many of the other tasks. Years of her life and time. A labor of love, but still a labor. And when he finally died, my grandmother was devastated and heartbroken and relieved. And she had held all of these feelings for years. God bless caregivers. God bless the people who care for others. It turns out the feeling of relief that my grandmother felt and named the morning after my grandfather died is common. In a resource developed for the Family Caregiver Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting caregivers, they say this about the feelings of relief that caregivers can feel. Many caregivers feel relieved that their ordeal is over and that the care receiver is no longer suffering. This is not something to feel guilty about. It's one of the many feelings that people have when caregiving ends. Grieving may have started years before even, with a gradual letting go process. I have such compassion for people who find themselves in this place of juggling forces of grief and relief. Not every caregiving relationship, as I'm sure many of you know, ends in death. Sometimes life moves people on to new things. Sometimes things just aren't vibing anymore. Sometimes hurt can make it hard to continue to care. When this happens, the impacts of caregiving can lead to poor self-care, which in time manifests itself as burnout. While burnout is not, as of yet, an official clinical diagnosis, many mental health professionals have identified a set of key symptoms that typify the phenomena named as burnout. These include poor concentration, exhaustion, conflicts at work and home, thoughts of anger and resentment, losing track of important details, chest pain, disturbed sleep, anxiety, depression, overwhelm. The World Health Organization describes this constellation of symptoms and behaviors as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is characterized by 3 dimensions: feelings of energy depletion and exhaustion, as we named above, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism, cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. In the book Burnout, Emily and Amelia Nagoski make a distinction between stress and stressors. In their understanding, stressors are what activate the stress response in the body, whereas stress is the neurological and physiological shift that happens in your body when we encounter these threats, when we encounter these stressors. Or in other terms, stressors are the external circumstances that cause stress, and stress is the physiological and cognitive change that is manifest in an individual in response to these external stressors. The process of dealing with stressors is one that is outwardly focused. It is one that's about adopting strategies, completing tasks, sending that email, finishing a project, having a hard but necessary conversation. These are all examples of strategies we might employ to deal with stressors. Stress, on the other hand, is an inward journey. Stress manifests through that activation inside of an individual and transforms them. And such a transformation requires additional inner work to undo. It requires additional inner transformation to overcome. Transforming stress takes time and space. And when those conditions aren't met, stress continues to evolve and eventually becomes burnout. This progression of stressor to stress to burnout is something many caregivers have experienced. There have been research articles in academic journals on this topic that go back decades. It's not a new thing that is being documented. Journals with populations studied, like spouses with partners undergoing cancer treatment, nurses overwhelmed by the rate of death in institutions, families and the stress of having a special needs child. I'm sure there are many more configurations of this dynamic. I'm sure many of us have felt this dynamic at times. Since the pandemic, this topic has been one frequently in the public eye, at least in ministry circles. I don't know how many news stories in the last few years I've heard about waves of pastors leaving their pulpit or waves of other professionals leaving their profession. And among those caregiving professions and these articles, I think we oftentimes like to think we are exempt. A quote from a CBS article from January of this year states that more than 4 in 10 clergy surveyed in the fall of 2023 had seriously considered leaving their congregation at least once since 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic began. And more than half of those had seriously considered leaving ministry altogether. I think we often like to think we are an exception to statistics like these when we encounter them. I know from experience that people are capable of adopting all sorts of strategies to avoid facing things we don't want to be true. And yet, when stressors produce stress that remains unaddressed, no matter how hard you want it to be true, it leads to burnout. Some of the research on burnout suggests that it's something that can be overcome with time and space, as I named earlier. But the longer that the symptoms have been present, the longer it takes to recover. And in some cases, recovery is not possible in the context the symptoms arose. Transforming burnout takes time. And if it's not addressed, it leads to continued degeneration. Turning back to this article about clergy considering leaving their congregations or ministry altogether, the research quoted also found that those thinking of quitting ministry entirely were more likely to be pastors of smaller churches, and those who work solo compared to those of larger staffs at larger churches. For so long, I have read this and, like I said, wanted to feel unique, that the trend being experienced by so many of my colleagues didn't apply to me. I watched so many of our Unitarian Universalist ministers come and go from pulpits in the last years. Locally, in the cohort I went into search with, everyone has resigned. And it's not just UUs, the same is true in other denominations. Even here locally, I have had conversations with interfaith colleagues, years of ministry, who have retired early. I wanted to believe my resilience or stubbornness could keep me going, but I'm not unique in that way. I have limits. Last Sunday, at the end of our congregational meeting, I said something that wasn't true. I went home after, and my words didn't sit right with me. I don't like that. I try to be someone just in general who doesn't make overly bold claims about life because I don't want to say things I can't live into. But once I said what I said then, I knew it wasn't true. Authenticity is important to me. Knowing yourself and listening to yourself and following your inner voice is so much of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist for me. And what I said did not sit right with me, and it was this. I said that this summer I was going to take some time off to rest, reflect, and rejuvenate myself, to come back for a year ahead, and hopefully years to come. The book of Ecclesiastes says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." I thought that what I needed was a short period of rest, a time to be away and seek rejuvenation for what comes next, but that's not true. As soon as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I went home, and for the next 2 days, I could barely eat. I wasn't sleeping. I took a lot of feelings out on my husband. And in a moment of dialogue, he said the thing I had been avoiding saying. Your job is killing you. You have no joy or room for yourself or for me. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. And in my life, I've reached a point where it is time to move on. I know rest isn't going to be enough. It's time for me to move on to something else. The place where I'm at in relation to stress and burnout has unfortunately reached a point I don't feel capable of recovering, not continuing here. Saying these words, naming this truth aloud is so hard, but it feels more honest than what I said last Sunday. It's felt more honest since I've talked with my colleagues, my friends, my family. I feel horrible that this is where things are at, that this is where our journey together will begin to end. But I'm also relieved for myself a little bit. It's a mix of grief and relief, a dichotomy many caregivers have wrestled with. And when they realize that their role and relationship has come to an end. I wish I had done a better job. I wish I had done a better job taking care of myself so I could take care of all of you. But I didn't. I wish it could have been different. But it's not. A lot feels confusing and uncertain for me, and I'm sure for all of you in amidst this. I can only imagine. What I do know, though, is that I'm looking forward to not being a minister in the foreseeable future. I'm looking forward to moving on to something else. As stressors have led to stress, have led to burnout, I've been led to make my decision to resign from Cedars. The board and I are going to be meeting this coming Thursday, and the specifics of everything will be worked out. I hope not to leave you completely hanging, but my decision feels clear to me. We'll share those details as they're known, but in closing my message, I want to offer an excerpt of a poem by John Ashbery titled Illustration. Much that is beautiful must be discarded so that we may resemble a taller impression of ourselves. Moths climb in the flame, alas, that wish only to be the flame. They do not lessen in our stature. We twinkle under the weight of indiscretions. But how could we tell that of the truth we know? She was the somber vestment. For that night, rockets sighed elegantly over the city, and there was feasting. There is so much in that moment, so many attitudes toward that flame. We might have soared from earth, watching her glide aloft in a peplum of bright leaves. But she, of course, was only an effigy of indifference, a miracle, not meant for us, as the leaves are not winter's, because it's the end.
Please recite after me as we extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of truth. Not the light of truth. The warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our service together is ending, but our service to the world unfolds in new ways. I pray we go forth from this time with faith and courage to face the uncertainty ahead.